The kingdom of Ashveil sat between two mountains like a secret someone forgot to keep. From the outside, it looked like any other wolf kingdom. Stone walls, tall gates, guards who never smiled. But inside those walls, something old was sleeping under the ground, and almost nobody remembered it was there. Almost nobody. Wren remembered. She was 23 years old, thin in the way that comes from skipping meals rather than from choice. With dark hair, she kept tied back so tightly it gave her a permanent look of being ready to run. She worked in the kitchens of the royal palace, though worked was a loose word for what she actually did. She carried trays. She refilled cups. She stood in corners and watched everything, and said almost nothing, because saying nothing was the safest thing a person like her could do in a place like this. Nobody in the palace knew where she came from. If you asked the head cook, she would tell you Wren showed up 3 years ago with a letter of recommendation from a noble house nobody could quite place, and the letter was good enough, and the girl worked hard enough, and nobody asked more questions than that. People rarely ask more questions than they needed to. That was one of the first things Wren had learned about court life. People believed what was convenient to believe. What the head cook did not know, what nobody in that palace knew, was that Wren's real family had guarded something under the East Garden for 11 generations before the current king's family had ever worn a crown. Her family had a duty older than the throne itself, and 3 years ago, her family had been wiped out by the very thing they had spent generations keeping asleep. She was the last one left, the last seal keeper of Ashveil. And she had come to the palace not to serve tea, but to watch over the ground the palace was built on, because someone had to, and there was no one left to do it but her. She never planned on being noticed, which was exactly why the night in the Great Hall went so badly. It started as an ordinary feast, the kind of event the kingdom held twice a year to remind its neighbors, and itself, that everything was fine. Long tables, roasted meat, musicians in the corner playing something too polite to actually be enjoyed, nobles in their finest clothes, trading gossip disguised as compliments. Wren had been given a tray of wine glasses and told to stand near the dais and not embarrass anyone. She was good at not embarrassing anyone. She had years of practice standing perfectly still while important people forgot she existed. King Ronan moved through the crowd that night the way he moved through everything, like a man doing his duty rather than living his life. He was 28, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that made people nervous before he even said a word. He had inherited the throne 4 years earlier, when his father died suddenly, and in those 4 years he had learned to wear the crown the way a man wears armor that doesn't quite fit, heavy, necessary, uncomfortable. He did not enjoy feasts, he tolerated them. He was making his way toward the dais, nodding at nobles he barely tolerated, when his path crossed close to where Wren was standing. Too close. Close enough that for one strange second, his eyes actually stopped on her instead of sliding past her the way a king's eyes usually slide past servants. Maybe it was her stillness. Most people in that room were performing for him, laughing too loud, bowing too low. She was not performing. She was simply standing there, tray in hand, calm as a stone in a river. Something about that calm irritated him. He was tired that night, more tired than usual, the kind of tired that makes small things feel bigger than they are. And irritation found the easiest target in the room. "You," he said, loud enough for the nearby nobles to hear. "Who let the help stand this close to the dais?" The hall went quiet. In that particular way courtrooms go quiet. Not silent, but hushed, everyone pretending not to listen, while listening very carefully. A few nobles laughed, not kind laughter, the kind that exists to make someone smaller so everyone else can feel bigger. Wren felt her face grow warm, not from embarrassment, from something closer to anger, though she buried it fast, the way she buried most things. She could have apologized. She could have stepped back and lowered her eyes and let the moment pass, the way she had let 100 moments pass before. That would have been the smart thing, the safe thing. Instead, something in her, maybe 3 years of exhaustion, maybe the weight of a secret nobody knew she carried, maybe just a bad night, made her answer instead. "Nobody important," she said, and she smiled when she said it. Not the smile people give when they are trying to please someone. The other kind. The kind that has a private joke tucked behind it. The kind that says, "You have no idea what you just said." A few nobles chuckled at her boldness, assuming she was simply making fun of herself to smooth things over. The king assumed the same thing. He gave her one more look, the kind of look a person gives something that doesn't fit where it's standing, and then he moved on, already forgetting her. Or so he thought. The truth was, the phrase stuck to him the way a splinter sticks under skin. Small, barely noticeable, but present, every time he shifted a certain way. Nobody important. He didn't understand why it bothered him. He had said far crueler things to far more important people that same week, as part of the endless political games that came with the crown. This was nothing. A servant girl, a passing insult, a moment forgotten by everyone in the room within the hour. Everyone except him. He told himself it was nothing and went back to his duties. 3 days passed before the first real sign of trouble arrived. It came from the northern border, carried by a tired scout who had ridden through the night without stopping. Strange tracks had been found near the tree line, tracks that did not belong to any wolf, any bear, any creature the border patrol recognized. Deep gouges in the earth, trees pushed over, as if something enormous had walked through the forest without bothering to go around them. Livestock had gone missing from 2 villages. Not killed, just gone, as if they had walked off on their own and never come back. The scout reported all this with his voice shaking slightly, the way a person's voice shakes when they are trying very hard not to sound afraid and failing. Ronan called his generals into the war room that same night. They argued for hours over maps and old treaties, throwing out theories about rival kingdoms testing the border, about wild beasts nobody had catalogued, about nothing that quite fit what the scout had described. Nobody in that room mentioned the old stories. The stories that every child in Ashveil had heard once, from a grandmother or an old nurse, about something that slept beneath the kingdom long before the first king ever built a wall. Stories about a thing so old it didn't have a proper name anymore, just titles whispered in different tongues over different centuries. Most people in the room didn't even remember the stories existed. They had been forgotten the way most old warnings get forgotten. Slowly, then all at once, replaced by newer worries. Ronan stood by the window during the argument, doing what he always did when the noise in a room became too much. He counted rooftops. It was a habit from childhood, something his old nurse had taught him to calm his temper. Count the rooftops. Breathe. Come back to the argument once your mind is quiet again. He was halfway through counting when a servant entered without being announced, set down a cup of tea on the table beside him, and left again without a word. He didn't think much of it at the time. Servants brought tea. That was simply what happened in palaces. It wasn't until later, staring at the empty cup, that he realized something odd. He hadn't asked for tea. He hadn't told anyone he wanted it. And yet it had arrived exactly when he needed it, exactly the way he liked it, with a small amount of honey and no milk. He would remember that detail much later, when it mattered. For now, he had other problems. His advisors did not let the border matter rest for long. Within a week, 3 separate council members had brought up, in 3 separate meetings, the subject of marriage. A king with no queen was a king with no heir, and a king with no heir was, in their eyes, a king inviting trouble he didn't need to invite. Ronan sat through these conversations the way he sat through most things he disliked, with a still face and a patient posture that gave nothing away, while underneath it he counted the minutes until he could leave the room. One advisor in particular pushed harder than the rest. Lady Isolde of the Eastern Estates was young, clever, and used to getting what she wanted through patience rather than force. She had been circling the throne for over a year, appearing at every feast in a new gown, always seated close enough to the king to be noticed, always saying exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. Ronan didn't dislike her. He simply didn't feel anything at all when he looked at her, which was, in its own way, worse than dislike. The kingdom needs stability, Isolde told him one evening, after a council meeting had ended and most of the room had cleared out. People feel safer when they know the throne has a future beyond one man. The kingdom has survived worse without my marriage being the solution, Ronan said. For now. Isolde's smile was polished, practiced, the kind of smile that had been perfected in front of a mirror rather than felt in the moment. But for now has a way of running out, Your Majesty. He didn't answer her directly. He simply excused himself, the way he had learned to excuse himself from conversations that circled too close to a decision he wasn't ready to make, and walked the long way back to his chambers, past the kitchens, past the servants' hall, though he told himself each time that this route was simply shorter. It never occurred to him, not yet, that it wasn't shorter at all. Meanwhile, 3 floors below the servants' quarters, in a room that did not officially exist on any map of the palace, Wren sat at a small wooden desk with a large old map spread out in front of her. The room was tucked behind a false wall near the old laundry cellars, accessible only through a passage her family had built generations before any of the current staff had been born. Nobody remembered the passage existed. That was exactly how she liked it. The map on her desk was not a map of roads or borders. It was a map of the ground beneath Ashveil, old ley lines drawn in faded ink, symbols marking places of power, and at the very center, beneath the east garden of the palace, a large circular symbol surrounded by careful, protective markings. The seal. She placed her palm flat against the paper, right over the symbol, the way her mother had taught her to do when she was very young. It was a habit more than a ritual, a way of checking, of listening, of making sure everything below was still where it should be. Something felt different tonight, a restlessness in the ground that she hadn't felt in 3 years, not since the night her family had died trying to keep this exact thing quiet. Not yet, she whispered to the map, as if the ground itself might be listening. You're not ready. Neither am I. The seal, being simply old ink on old paper, did not answer. But somewhere far beneath the palace, something shifted in its sleep, the way an old dog shifts when a noise outside almost, but not quite, wakes it. Wren sat back and closed her eyes for a long moment. She was tired in a way that had nothing to do with carrying trays all day. She was tired the way a person gets tired from carrying a secret so heavy that setting it down, even for a moment, felt like it would break something. She thought about the man who had called her nobody important 3 nights ago. She had meant the insult as a shield, a way of hiding in plain sight, the way she always did. And yet some small, foolish part of her had felt a strange satisfaction watching him try to place her and fail. He didn't know. Nobody in that entire glittering hall knew what she actually was. And there was a kind of quiet power in that, even if it came wrapped in humiliation. She rolled up the map carefully, hid it back in its usual place beneath a loose floorboard, and went to bed knowing that whatever was stirring beneath the palace would not wait forever. Wren had one friend in the palace, a young laundry maid named Della, who talked enough for both of them and never seemed to notice how little Wren actually said in return. Della had a round, open face and a habit of humming while she worked, and she was the only person in the entire palace who had ever asked Wren a question simply because she wanted to know the answer, not because she needed something from her. "You looked like you wanted to bite someone at that feast," Della said one morning, scrubbing a stubborn stain out of a tablecloth while Wren folded linens beside her. "The way the king talked to you, bold of him." "He didn't mean anything by it," Wren said, which was mostly true. He hadn't meant anything by it. That was almost the worst part. Didn't stop you from smiling like you knew something he didn't. Della glanced sideways, curious in the easy, harmless way she was curious about everything. "You always do that. Smile like you're keeping a secret." Wren said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say. Della didn't push. That was another thing Wren liked about her. She asked once, and if the answer didn't come, she let it go, humming her way back into the work in front of her. Wren thought about her family more in those weeks than she had allowed herself to in a long time. She thought about her mother's hands, rough and steady, placing her own palm against the map the way you'd teach a child to write their name. She thought about her father, who used to tell her that the seal wasn't a wall keeping something out, but a promise keeping something patient, that whatever slept beneath the garden wasn't evil so much as old, and old things, if respected, could be reasoned with far longer than anyone expected. She thought about the night 3 years ago when the promise had nearly broken. She had been 16, asleep in the small stone house her family kept near the border, when the ground itself had woken her, a low hum under the floorboards that felt less like sound and more like a held breath finally released. By the time she made it outside, the house was already burning, and her parents and her older brother were already gone, and there had been no time to grieve because the thing that killed them was still moving, still hungry, and someone had to finish what her family had started, or the whole kingdom would learn exactly how patient it wasn't. She had done what her mother taught her. She had gone to the garden herself, alone, 16 years old and shaking, and she had pressed her palm to the ground and spoken the old words her family had passed down for 11 generations, and somehow, impossibly, it had been enough. The thing had gone quiet again. Not gone, never gone, just quiet, the way a storm goes quiet before it decides whether to pass or return. She had walked to Ashveil's palace 3 months later with a forged letter and a new name pinned to her old grief, because she had realized, standing in the ashes of her family's home, that the safest place to guard a secret was close enough to watch it, and far enough that nobody would think to look for her there. Nobody had looked, not until a tired king with too much on his mind had made the mistake of actually seeing her. 2 days later, she was summoned to the throne room by name. This surprised her more than it should have. Servants were rarely summoned by name unless they had done something wrong. She walked the long hallway toward the throne room with her heart beating a little too fast, running through every possible mistake she might have made, every possible way her secret might have slipped. When she arrived, the king was alone, seated not on his throne but on the low steps in front of it, looking less like a king and more like a tired young man who had been awake for several days straight. "You're not kitchen staff," he said, without looking up. It wasn't a question, so she didn't treat it like one. "I'm whatever the roster says I am." That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting from a nobody. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Not quite anger. Something closer to amusement, quickly buried, the way a king buries anything that might make him seem soft in front of a servant. "The border is compromised," he said instead, changing the subject the way powerful people often do when they don't want to examine their own reactions too closely. "Strange tracks, missing livestock. My generals have theories, none of them good." Wren kept her face carefully blank. "Old things wake up when new kings get comfortable," she said. "You should ask who buried them the first time." It was a risk, saying even that much. But something about the exhaustion on his face made her want to give him a thread to pull, even if she wasn't ready to hand him the whole rope. He looked at her properly then, the way he hadn't bothered to look at her in the great hall 3 nights before. Not at a servant, at a person. "What do you know about it?" he asked. "I know old stories," she said carefully. "Servants hear things. Kitchens are full of old women who remember what nobles forget." It wasn't a lie, exactly. It was simply not the whole truth. He studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies a locked door, trying to guess what's on the other side of it without a key. "Find out what you can," he said finally. "Ask your old women. Bring me what you learn." It was, in its own strange way, the first time anyone in that palace had asked her opinion about anything in 3 years. She left the throne room with her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Over the following days, Ronan found himself doing something he hadn't expected, thinking about her. Not constantly, not in any way he would have admitted out loud, but in small, unwelcome moments. During council meetings when his mind wandered, during meals when the food tasted like nothing, during the quiet hours before sleep, when a man's thoughts go where they please regardless of what he wants. He told himself it was simply curiosity, a servant who spoke to a king the way no servant should, who seemed to know things she shouldn't know, who appeared exactly when needed with tea nobody had ordered. It was strange. Kings were trained to notice strange things. That was all this was. That was what he told himself, anyway. He began finding excuses to be in places where she might be. It was easy enough. A king can go anywhere in his own palace without explanation. He would find himself near the kitchens around the time the evening meal was being prepared. He would linger in hallways she was known to walk through. He told himself each time that he was simply checking on palace matters, the way a good king should. Wren noticed, of course. She noticed everything. It was part of what had kept her alive and hidden for 3 years. She noticed the king's visits growing more frequent, his questions growing less about borders and more about her, where she came from, what she thought about things, whether she was ever afraid of anything. She answered carefully, giving him pieces of truth wrapped in enough vagueness to keep her secret safe. She told him she came from a small village that no longer existed. She told him she had lost her family young. She told him, when he pushed just a little too far one evening, that she was afraid of very few things, and none of them were things he could help with. "Try me," he said. She almost told him the truth in that moment. Almost. The word sat right at the back of her throat, heavy and dangerous. But 3 years of careful silence held her back, the way habit always holds people back from the things they most want to say. "Some other time," she said instead. He didn't push further, but he remembered the promise in those words, and so did she. One evening, a few days after that conversation, he found her sitting alone on a low stone bench at the edge of the east garden, long after the rest of the palace had gone quiet for the night. She hadn't heard him approach. For once her guard was down, her shoulders loose in a way he had never seen them, her face turned up toward the sky, as if she were listening to something he couldn't hear. He almost turned around and left her to it. A king had no business intruding on a servant's rare moment of peace, but something about the stillness of the scene held him in place, and before he had fully decided to, he was walking toward her across the grass. She heard him then, and her shoulders came back up, the guard sliding back into place so quickly he almost doubted he had seen it slip at all. "You're not supposed to be out here this late," she said, not quite an accusation, not quite a joke. "It's my garden," he pointed out. "Doesn't mean you're supposed to be in it." But she shifted slightly on the bench, leaving room, and after a moment's hesitation, he sat down beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of the day, still trapped in the old stone. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that would have felt unbearable with almost anyone else in the palace, and felt, with her, oddly comfortable. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked eventually. "The crown, all of it." "Every day," he admitted, surprising himself with how easily the truth came out. He didn't say things like that to anyone, not his advisors, not the nobles who circled him at every feast, not even the friends he'd had before the crown had quietly swallowed most of his friendships whole. "I didn't ask for it. My father died faster than anyone expected, and 1 week I was a prince who mostly got to ride horses and avoid meetings, and the next I was signing treaties I barely understood. You understand them now. Some of them." He looked over at her. "Do you ever get tired of pretending to be nobody important?" The question landed harder than he meant it to. He saw something flicker across her face, not anger exactly, but something close to it, old and tired, and carefully controlled. "Every day," she said, echoing his own words back to him, and for a moment neither of them said anything else, because there wasn't a safe way to say what came next. "I'm sorry," he said finally, "for the feast, for what I said. You already apologized, weeks ago." "I don't think I meant it properly the first time." He turned to face her fully now, the moonlight catching the sharp, tired lines of her face. "I've thought about it more than I should have. A king shouldn't spend this much time thinking about one sentence he said to a servant carrying a wine tray." "Maybe the servant wasn't just a servant," she said quietly, and then seemed to catch herself, looking away toward the dark shape of the garden hedges, as if she could take the words back by refusing to look at him while they hung in the air. "Maybe not," he agreed, not pushing, though everything in him wanted to. They sat there a while longer, the space between them smaller than it had been at the start of the conversation, though neither of them had moved. When she finally stood to leave, she paused, looking down at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between fondness and warning, the look of someone deciding whether to let a door stay open a little longer or close it before it was too late. "Good night, Your Majesty," she said. "Wren," he said her name the way a person says something they're trying to memorize. "Thank you. For the tea, all of it. I know it was you." She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it either. She simply smiled, the private smile, the one with a joke tucked behind it, and walked back toward the palace, leaving him alone on the stone bench with the distinct, uncomfortable feeling that he had just been given something valuable without fully understanding what it was. He thought about that evening often in the weeks that followed, turning it over the way a person turns over a coin they aren't sure is real gold or clever imitation. He didn't know, yet, that the night in the garden was the closest she would let herself get to him before everything else in the kingdom demanded her attention again. Not everyone in the palace was pleased by the king's growing habit of lingering near the kitchens. Lady Isolde noticed first, the way people who are watching closely for a threat always notice things before anyone else does. She saw the king's eyes follow a certain servant girl across a room during a minor gathering, saw the small, unguarded moment before he caught himself and looked away. It was nothing, really. Half a second, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Isolde was looking for it. She said nothing at first. She simply began watching Wren more carefully, the way a hawk watches a field, before deciding whether the movement in the grass is worth the dive. She noted which hallways Wren walked. She noted the strange gaps in the household records, the missing letter of recommendation, the way the head cook's memory seemed to slide sideways whenever anyone asked exactly when Wren had first arrived. "There's something wrong with that girl," Isolde said to one of her ladies-in-waiting, quietly over tea that had nothing to do with honey or milk. "People don't simply appear from nowhere. Everyone comes from somewhere." Her lady-in-waiting shrugged, uninterested. "She's a servant. Servants come and go." "Not this one," Isolde said, and left it there, filing the thought away, the way she filed away everything useful, for a moment when it might matter. That moment arrived sooner than anyone expected. It began with a village near the northern tree line, one of the smaller settlements that rarely sent word to the capital about anything, because there was rarely anything worth sending word about. A shepherd noticed his flock behaving strangely one evening, pressed together in the corner of the field furthest from the trees, refusing to graze, bleating in a way that had nothing to do with wolves or weather. By midnight, the ground beneath the village well had begun to hum, low and steady, the same sound Wren had woken to 3 years earlier in a house that no longer existed. She felt it from the palace before any messenger arrived to report it. She woke in the middle of the night with her whole body tense, the way a person wakes from a dream about falling even after the falling has stopped. She knew, the way her mother had known these things, the way her family had always known, that the ground was speaking, and it was not speaking calmly. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for the king. She dressed quickly, took nothing but a small bag her mother had once carried on nights just like this one, and slipped out of the palace through a servant's gate that officially didn't exist, the same way her hidden room officially didn't exist. She rode through the dark for hours, reaching the village just before dawn, and found exactly what she feared: a thin crack in the earth near the old well, glowing faintly with a light that wasn't quite light, more like the memory of light, and a handful of villagers gathered nervously at a safe distance, too frightened to approach and too stubborn to abandon their homes. She didn't explain herself. She simply walked past them, knelt at the crack, and pressed her palm flat against the broken ground the way her mother had taught her, murmuring words in a language none of the villagers recognized, old and patient and worn smooth by generations of use. It took most of the night. The crack did not want to close. Something on the other side of it pushed back, testing her, the way it had tested her family for 11 generations before her, curious whether this new, smaller pair of hands was strong enough to hold what older, larger hands once held. She thought, at one particularly bad moment, that it might win. She thought about her family, about the fire, about how easy it would be to simply let go and let the ground swallow her, along with everything else. But she thought too about the empty room behind the false wall, about a cup of tea that kept arriving unasked, about a king who had called her nobody important and then spent weeks proving, in small clumsy ways, that he didn't quite believe his own words anymore. She held on. The crack closed just as the sun came up, sealing itself with a low sound like a sigh, and the humming beneath the well went quiet again. The villagers never learned her name. They spoke for years afterward about the strange girl who arrived in the night and left before anyone could properly thank her, riding back toward the capital with dawn light behind her and exhaustion in every line of her body. She returned to the palace before the morning shift began, slipping back through the same hidden gate, and was standing in the kitchens with a tray in her hands by the time anyone noticed she had been gone at all. Nobody noticed. Nobody except, 3 days later, King Ronan, when a report reached him about strange lights near a northern village that had resolved themselves without explanation, and he found himself, without quite meaning to, glancing toward the kitchens with a question he didn't know how to ask. He said nothing about it to his council. He simply filed the thought away, the way he had learned to file away small, unexplainable things, and told himself he would ask her about it eventually, when the moment felt right. The moment never felt right. The border trouble grew worse before it grew better. A third village reported missing livestock. Then a farmer went missing entirely, found 3 days later wandering in the woods with no memory of where he had been, or how he had gotten there. His eyes, according to the healer who examined him, had a strange emptiness to them, like windows in a house nobody lived in anymore. The kingdom began to whisper, not loud enough for panic, not yet, but enough for fear to start creeping into ordinary conversations. People spoke of old legends again, the ones their grandparents used to tell, about something ancient sleeping beneath the land that the first kings of Ashveil had sealed away at great cost. Ronan called for the old palace librarian, a sharp-eyed woman named Hedda, who had worked in the archives for over 40 years and remembered things most people had let slip from memory entirely. He asked her about the old stories, about seals and sleeping things, and the founding of the kingdom. Hedda pulled dusty scrolls from shelves that hadn't been touched in decades, laying them across a long table with the careful reverence of someone handling something both precious and dangerous. There was a seal, she told him, tracing faded ink with one crooked finger. Placed beneath what is now the East Garden, 11 kings before your line took the throne. A single family was given the duty of maintaining it, not with magic exactly, more like attention, watching, keeping something old, asleep, by making sure nobody disturbed it. What happened to the family? Ronan asked. Hedda's expression darkened. The records say they died out. About 3 years ago, if the parish notes are accurate. Whole family, gone in a single night. Officially it was recorded as a fire. A fire, Ronan repeated slowly. That's what the report says. Hedda's mouth pressed into a thin line, the look of a woman who had spent 40 years learning which official reports could be trusted and which ones were simply the most convenient explanation available at the time. But fires don't usually leave scorch marks shaped like claws, Your Majesty. I saw the original Scout's notes before someone thought better of it and rewrote them. Whoever filed the second version wanted the matter closed quietly. Why would anyone want it closed quietly? Because admitting the seal keepers were attacked means admitting the seal itself might be failing, Hedda said. And a kingdom that thinks its oldest protection might be failing is a kingdom that starts asking questions nobody in this palace has good answers for. Easier to call it a fire. Easier still to forget the family existed at all, given enough time. Ronan sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling somewhere behind his ribs. Was there a survivor? Hedda hesitated, which was, for a woman who rarely hesitated about anything, its own kind of answer. The notes don't say, But notes like these are rarely complete. Whoever wrote the second report might have simply not known, or might have known and left it out on purpose. Why would they leave it out on purpose? Because a dead family is a closed matter, Hedda said quietly. A missing girl is a question somebody might eventually go looking to answer. 3 years ago, the same time Wren had appeared at the palace with her strange, unplaceable letter of recommendation. Ronan felt something cold settle in his stomach, the kind of feeling a man gets right before a puzzle he's been avoiding suddenly starts fitting together whether he wants it to or not. He went looking for her immediately, moving through the palace faster than a king usually moves, ignoring the confused looks from nobles he passed without acknowledging. He found the kitchens, then the servants' hall. Nobody had seen her that evening. He checked the roster, the official list of household staff, and found her name listed as it always was, Wren, kitchens, 3rd floor. But when he asked the head cook directly, the woman frowned and admitted, almost embarrassed, that she couldn't actually remember hiring the girl, couldn't remember which year she'd started, couldn't produce the letter of recommendation Hedda had mentioned because nobody could find it anywhere in the records. It was as if Wren existed everywhere on paper and nowhere in memory, the way a shadow exists everywhere light does and nowhere at all on its own. What Ronan did not know, and would not learn until much later, was that Lady Isolde had reached the same conclusion he had, several days earlier, and had acted on it far more quickly than he ever could. She had gone to Wren directly, cornering her in an empty hallway one evening with the polished calm of someone who had rehearsed the conversation many times before having it. "I don't know what you are," Isolde said quietly, "but I know what you're not. You're not kitchen staff, and I know the king has started looking at you the way he's never looked at anyone I've introduced him to." Wren said nothing, which was, as always, its own kind of answer. "I don't care what your secret is," Isolde continued. "I care that a kingdom cannot be ruled by a king who's distracted by something he can't explain to his council. Whatever you are, whatever you're hiding, it isn't fair to him, and it isn't fair to Ashveil." "You don't know anything about fair," Wren said, the first real edge she had ever let slip in front of another noble. "Maybe not," Isolde admitted, "but I know you're not planning to stay forever. Girls like you never do. So do everyone a favor and leave before he gets attached enough that your leaving actually breaks something." It wasn't a threat. Not exactly. It was worse than a threat, because it was true, or true enough to sting. Wren had always known her time in the palace was borrowed, that a life spent guarding a secret could not also be a life spent building something with someone else. She had simply let herself forget it, these past weeks. In small, foolish moments, she hadn't let herself examine too closely. She didn't answer Isolde. She simply walked away, and began, that same night, to plan her leaving, not because Isolde had frightened her into it, but because Isolde had said out loud a fear Wren had been carrying quietly for weeks. She told herself it wasn't about the king at all. She told herself it was about the seal, about the restlessness in the ground that had never fully settled since the night at the northern village, about the growing risk that someone in the palace would eventually connect the missing family, the empty records, and the strange girl who always seemed to be nearby whenever the ground grew loud. She told herself a great many things that week. Not all of them were true. He went to the old laundry cellars on instinct more than knowledge, some part of him remembering the exact hallway she always seemed to appear from whenever she brought him tea unasked. Behind a stack of old crates, he found a section of wall that didn't quite match the stone around it, a door disguised as nothing at all. Inside, he found the room. It was small, plain, and empty in a way that felt deliberate, rather than natural. The emptiness of a place that had been cleared out quickly and carefully by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. A desk sat against one wall, wiped clean of dust in a room otherwise thick with it. On the wall above the desk, scratched into the old plaster with something that clearly wasn't a knife, was a single word. Later. Ronan stood there for a long time, staring at that word, feeling something in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. He understood, slowly, painfully, exactly what he had missed. The servant girl he had insulted in front of the entire court, the one he had dismissed as nobody important, was very likely the last living member of the family that had guarded Ashveil's oldest and most dangerous secret. And she had been standing in his palace for 3 years, quietly protecting a kingdom that didn't even know it needed protecting, while he called her nothing, in front of a room full of people who mattered far less than she did. And now she was gone. He didn't know if she had run because he had gotten too close to the truth, or because something else had frightened her away, or because she had simply decided her work in the palace was finished. He didn't know if she was safe. He didn't know if he would ever see her again. What he did know, standing alone in that hidden room, with dust settling around his boots, was that the ground beneath Ashveil had been restless for days, and now the one person who understood why was nowhere to be found. The following weeks were hard ones for the kingdom. Without anyone tending to it, though most people in the palace never knew there had been anyone tending to it at all, the disturbance at the border grew slightly worse before it stabilized on its own. More livestock vanished. 2 more villagers reported strange, foggy memories after wandering too close to the tree line. The generals doubled the border patrols, built new watchtowers, sent letters to neighboring kingdoms asking about similar reports. Nothing worked as well as nobody's quiet, unnoticed attention had worked for 3 years. Ronan changed during those weeks, in ways his advisors noticed but didn't fully understand. He grew quieter, more patient with the servants, more careful with his words, as if he had learned something important about the danger of underestimating people who stood silently in corners holding trays. He kept the plaster wall in that hidden room exactly as he'd found it. He gave orders that the room was not to be touched, not to be cleared, not to be given to anyone else. Some of the staff thought it was strange, a king keeping an empty servant's room preserved like a shrine. Nobody asked him about it directly. People had learned, over those weeks, that there were certain questions the king did not want to answer. He spent more time with Hedda in the archives, learning everything he could about the old seal, about the family that had guarded it, about the responsibilities his own ancestors had quietly ignored for generations, while pretending old stories were simply stories. He learned that his family owed a debt far older than his crown, a debt he had never known about until the person paying it had already walked out of his life. He thought, often, about the words scratched into that wall. Later. Not goodbye, not never, later. He held on to that word, the way a man holds on to a promise made by someone who never technically promised anything. The disturbance at the border eventually settled, though nobody in the war room could explain exactly why. The tracks stopped appearing. The livestock losses tapered off. The farmer who had wandered the woods with empty eyes slowly recovered his memory, piece by piece, over the following months, though he never spoke about what he had seen out there, no matter how gently the healers asked. Life in Ashveil returned to something like normal. The kind of normal that sits on top of old secrets the way grass grows over a grave, green and quiet, giving no sign of what lies beneath. Ronan ruled differently after that. He listened more carefully to the people around him, especially the ones nobody else bothered listening to. He asked the names of servants he had never bothered learning before. He treated the quiet, careful work of ordinary people with a respect he had never given it in the earlier years of his reign, because he had learned, in the hardest way possible, that the person doing the smallest, most invisible job in a room might be the one thing standing between that room and disaster. Sometimes, late at night, when the palace was quiet and his advisors had all gone to bed, he would walk down to the old laundry cellars and stand in the small, empty room with the word scratched into the plaster. He never knew if she was watching from somewhere, keeping her own quiet distance, the way she had for 3 years before he'd ever noticed her. He never knew if she had left the kingdom entirely, or simply moved deeper into the shadows she was so good at disappearing into. He never knew if the ground beneath Ashveil stayed calm because of something she was still doing, somewhere out of sight, or because whatever had stirred had simply gone back to sleep on its own. But every time he stood in that room, he felt something he couldn't quite explain, a sense that the debt wasn't closed, that the story wasn't finished, that somewhere, Someone was still keeping watch even though nobody had asked her to, and nobody had thanked her for it. Years later, long after the border trouble had become nothing more than an old story parents told their children about the year something strange happened in the woods, the kingdom of Ashveil remained calm and steady under King Ronan's rule. He never married, despite the pressure from his advisors to secure the family line. He never gave a clear reason why, though the older members of his staff, the ones who had been there long enough to remember, sometimes exchanged knowing glances whenever the subject came up. Lady Isolde eventually married a lord from a neighboring kingdom, a decent enough match that gave her the influence and stability she had always wanted, if not the throne she had once hoped for. She and Ronan remained on polite, distant terms for the rest of his reign, two people who had once wanted very different things from the same impossible situation and had, in their own ways, made peace with not getting them. She never spoke publicly about her conversation with Wren in that hallway, but sometimes, late in her life, she would tell the story quietly to her own daughter, framing it not as a warning but as a strange kind of confession. The one time she had tried to protect a kingdom by pushing away the very thing that was already protecting it. Della, the laundry maid, stayed at the palace for the rest of her working years, rising eventually to oversee the entire household staff. She never learned the full truth about her old friend, though she suspected more than she ever said aloud. Once a year, on the same date every year, she left a small cup of something sweet outside the old laundry cellars, humming to herself the whole time, never quite explaining to the younger staff why she did it, only that it felt like the right thing to do. He kept a small tea ritual for the rest of his life. Every single night, without fail, unless illness or travel made it impossible, he walked down to the small room behind the false wall and left a fresh cup on the old desk. Honey, no milk. He never asked the staff to do it for him. He never explained it to anyone who asked, and eventually people stopped asking, the way people stop asking about any habit that has simply become part of who someone is. Some mornings the cup was untouched, sitting exactly where he'd left it, the tea gone cold. Those mornings, he told himself, simply meant she was busy elsewhere, doing whatever quiet work she still did in whatever corner of the world needed her most. But some mornings, not many, not often, but enough to matter, enough to keep a stubborn man's hope alive for decades longer than hope usually survives. The cup was empty. He never mentioned this to anyone. He never tried to catch whoever was drinking it, though there were nights, in his younger years, when he sat awake in the shadows of that small room, waiting, hoping for even a glimpse of her. She never let herself be seen. He respected that, eventually, the way you learn to respect a wild animal's need for distance even while wishing it would come closer. He simply kept leaving the tea, night after night, year after year, the way a person leaves a light on for someone they hope will eventually find their way home. The East Garden was expanded during his reign. Its old paths widened, new flowers planted around its edges. Few people knew that beneath its soil lay something far older than the flowers, something that had been sleeping soundly for years, undisturbed, unbothered, exactly as it should be. And in a small, plain room behind a false wall near the old laundry cellars, a room the palace records still listed, quietly and without explanation, as reserved and not to be touched, a single word remained scratched into the old plaster, faded slightly with time but never repainted over. Later. Nobody in the palace ever fully understood what it meant. Nobody but the king, who passed by that hallway more often than his duties required, and who never quite stopped waiting. Because some people don't disappear because they are running away from something. Some people disappear because they are waiting to see if anyone will bother looking for them. And Ronan, in his own slow, stubborn, imperfect way, never stopped looking. Not once, not ever, not even when the years made it seem foolish to keep hoping. He simply kept the tea warm, and the room untouched, and the word on the wall exactly as it was, because somewhere deep down, in the part of himself that had learned this lesson the hardest way possible, he believed that later was a promise, even if nobody had ever said it out loud. And in a kingdom built on old secrets and quiet debts, that small, stubborn belief was, in its own way, the truest kind of hope there was.